we were looking at the rhythm of the KJV, and I want to pick up with that again this morning. We're looking at the revision committee, the final revision committee, and what they had to do with the wording of the KJV. If a person owned no other book in the Western world, I guess the book that he would pick would not just be the Bible, but would be the KJV, the King James Version of the Bible. I have a quote here from another writer describing the beauty of the language of the KJV, which is one of the things that's made it so long-lasting in modern Westernism. It said, always in considering this, our English classic, we must remember that behind it were the world's profoundest religious thoughts, uttered by the Hebrews in concrete, vivid, and figurative expression. I mean, it'd be difficult to have the world's greatest book telling the world's worst story. I mean, here you've got the greatest book telling the greatest story, uttering the most profound theological and ethical truth that man could aspire to. And he aspires to that only because it's revelation and not the product of human grappling. It was this rich ore which was cast into the English crucible to be heated hot with religious fervor and with the zest of a new intellectual awakening, a new freedom of the individual, a new national loyalty. Out of the fire came this book, so simple, direct, and suggestive in language, so beautiful and resonant in rhythm, so majestic and inspiring in tone, that as literature it is said even to surpass the original, that is, of the Greek and Hebrew, as pure writing ability is concerned. And no one influence has been so great in the life of the English-speaking people, religiously, morally, socially, politically, as has this one book. And even a person so famous as the non-Christian Thomas Huxley, in writing about the KJV, said, "It is written in the noblest and purest English, and abounds in exquisite beauties of pure literary form." And, finally, that it forbids the veriest hind who never left his village to be ignorant of the existence of other countries and other civilizations, and of a great past stretching back to the furthest limits of the oldest civilizations of the world. As we've seen, people have been, until very modern times, actually raised in their study of history and their study of writing and their study of reading right on the Holy Scriptures. And even the earliest English grammars, grade school grammars, were actually based on Scripture and based on the Bible. And of course the Bible used as the basis, was not used any English translation, but was the King James Version of the Bible. And here Huxley is saying that the possession of this Bible forbids the most ignorant person in the most distant tribe, if he has this and can read it and understand it, it forbids him of being ignorant of all of the past history of mankind, of all of these ancient civilizations that other people have to go to school to study and learn about, the Assyrians and the Egyptians and the Babylonians and Sumerians and Akkadians and the Hittites. It's all right in the Bible. And to learn to read and write, well, there's no greater masterpiece in most people's estimation than the Bible, and than the Bible in the KJV version. So if you're wanting to learn to read or write, now I recognize the arguments that we don't speak like they do in Elizabethan times, but if you want to read and write, what better place would there be to go to than the greatest book that's ever been written, the Bible, and it as we see it in the KJV. And so coming to the revision committee itself, these men on the committee and the men not on the committee, but ones who served as translators, were not men who were just biblical exegetes, scholars, and theologians. They were not just churchmen. But as we see from the production of this book that we now all have, these men were literary greats. Now, individually, they haven't gone down into history as maybe Shakespeare has, or Milton, or some other character, but when you get them together as a group, then in the translation of the Hebrew and Greek, they surpass anything that's come before them and anything that follows as well. These men are poets of first class and of the highest rank. poets like we don't find anymore today. And so they are the ones putting all of this in. Now, coming to the revision committee, how do we know exactly what took place during this time? Well, one of the men, John Boyce, who was probably the chief member on the revision committee for the KJV, kept rather extensive daily notes as to what they were offering as proposals, as to what had come to them from all of the various groups, the 6 groups, 2 at Westminster, 2 at Cambridge, and 2 at Oxford, and what they saw as a product that left their hands. He stipulated in his will, Boyce, the safekeeping of these after his death. He died in 1643. However, these notes were lost shortly thereafter in 1688 and were only recently discovered among some of the papers of William Fulman, who was a 17th century collector. And they were discovered at Corpus Christi College Library at Oxford. And they were discovered only in 1964. And the reason that we know that they belong to Boyce is because of the similarity in the handwriting. But they've been lost. They were lost here for several hundred years, and we knew there was a revision committee. We know that certain of the KJV guidelines make stipulations for a revision committee, as well as the so-called overseers. Now, whether that was ever fulfilled or not, we don't know, as we've discussed before. And so we would like to know, what did the revision committee actually accomplish? But the only notes that we had of that were lost for all of these hundreds of years, only recently discovered in 1964. And so let me give you some of the examples of their work. They were stationed at Stationers' Hall in London, remember, to give you a feel for the process of the various alternatives they thought were appropriate for certain passages, and then how we see those passages in the KJV as it ended up, which is going to show us something about the revision committee. For instance, if you'll turn to 2 Timothy 2:15, or you may have that memorized already, 2 Timothy 2:15. Study to show thyself approved unto God, a workman that needeth not to be ashamed, rightly dividing the word of truth. Now, Boyce offered for this middle phrase the following: a faithful laborer, a constant laborer, a laborer not ashamed of his work. And so we don't have laborer here, but we've got workman. So we see that the revision committee offered their suggestion here, and whoever comes after the revision committee, notably the 2 final editors, Miles Smith and Thomas Bilson, must have changed matters somewhat. And in fact they did. The final editors took the English word workman rather than the Latin term laborer. They preferred to stay with an English term here, workman, rather than Boyce's suggestion of laborer, which is a Latin term. Then in Titus 2 in verse 10, we have this peculiar phrase, not purloining, but showing all good fidelity. Boyce gave the new phrase, no filchers, F-I-L-C-H-E-R-S, no filchers. Now, do you know what filcher means? We don't really use the word that much today. Well, it's a rather new word when it was used by Boyce, and it probably was only so old as 1561. And we're talking about 1609 to 1610 with this work being done. It's a new word dating only to 1561. But we see the KJV in its final edition went back a little earlier and ended up with this phrase, not purloining, which dates to the year 1440, the term purloining. Well, both are obscure today. We use neither the term filcher nor purloining, but your modern versions will have something about stealing. because that in fact is what they're talking about here. Not purloining, or not filching, or no filchers, no stealers, no thieves, not stealing. And probably the NIV will have stealing. In Titus 3:8, that they might be careful to maintain good works. Boyce gave us, be careful to exercise themselves in honest trades. In Hebrews 4:15, Andrew Downs, another member of the Cambridge Apocrypha group, along with John Boyce, Andrew Downs suggested for this last part of Hebrews 4:15, such an one as had experience in all things. Such an one as had experience in all things. And what do we have? But was in all points tempted like as we are. In all points tempted like as we are. I'll make my point from these observations here in a moment. In Hebrews 6:6, for this phrase, put him to an open shame. Put him to an open shame. Boyce suggested, caused him to be had in derision, or traduced him. In Hebrews 11:1, Boyce defined faith as follows. Faith is a most sure warrant for things. It is a being of things hoped for, a discovery, a demonstration of things that are not seen. You compare that with what you have there. In James chapter 1 and verse 5, for this phrase, upbraideth not. If any of you lack wisdom, let him ask of God, that giveth to all men liberally, and upbraideth not. Boyce gave twitting or hitting in the teeth. Then if you lack wisdom, let him ask of God, and this is the God who gives liberally and does not twit or hit in the teeth. And we have upbraideth not. Well, my purpose in looking at just a few of those is to show you from these few examples that the final editors are the ones whose hands are really seen in the work of the KJV, and not this very elaborate revision committee that was supposed to serve as a check or balance for the original groups, the 6 groups at the 3 different locations. We're to see their hand in all of this. What did they have to say? And do we see it in the KJV as it finally came off the press? Not really. Miles Smith and Thomas Bilson, the 2 final editors, seem to change almost everything that the revision committee put in. And more than anyone else, as I've said before, the KJV is the work of Miles Smith, the composer of the preface to the work entitled The Translators to the Reader, and the man most responsible for the KJV in its final form. His hand is most evident in the final product. And so although John Reynolds, the Puritan leader at the early Hampton Court Conference before King James I and the Sixth, although he often is referred to as the father of the KJV because he got the program going, got the ball rolling, Miles Smith is really the man to whom we're most indebted for the work of the KJV. So I'm just trying to show you with these few examples how things changed between the revision committee and what you have in your hands now. There is an interesting phrase that somehow escaped evidently everyone's notice. Of all the euphemisms and Elizabethan terminology and the strange, unexpected twists in sentences, perhaps none is as comical as 1 Kings 13:27. I don't know if you've ever noticed this before, but it's one of the strangest things you'll find in the KJV, rather unexpectedly so, and somehow it slipped the notice of all of the writers, the editors, and the revisers. And if you didn't have anything else and you just listened to this, I'm sure it would be comical. And he spake unto his sons, saying, saddle me, the ass. And so they saddled him. Now, it's a very ambiguous statement here. We think that we know what really happened here in the story. He's not calling himself that, and so they put a saddle on their dad. But it's very ambiguous. You need a few more words, and you need to arrange this a little better. But somehow it simply escaped notice of the revisers and the editors. He spake unto his son, saying, Saddle me, the ass. And so they saddled him. Every time I see that, I just laugh. I just chuckle out loud to myself at how strange the language is. It's so ambiguous. But I think we do know what really happens. Go saddle me, the ass that I want over there. And so they went and saddled him, the ass, not their dad. That's not what he's calling himself. Well, after all their work and all our work, we finally get the work printed and published in the year 1611. When it came out, it had no particular name, but it has come to be known by two names. The popular American name is the King James Version, KJV. What you'll always hear the British people refer to it by is the AV, the Authorized Version. Now, how it came to be called by the American name, the KJV, I think is readily discernible. It's due to the patronage or the influence of James I. And hence it's been referred to since then as the King James Version of the Bible. Of course, I'm sure that's confused people over the years, some perhaps sillily thinking that King James himself was the one who translated, who gave us the Bible. But no, it came from his influence and under his patronage. How it came to be called the AV, the Authorized Version, that is another matter. Now, let's discuss that issue, how it has come to be referred to as the AV, the Authorized Version. As I say, it comes out in 1611 with no particular name. But the first thing that goes to press and that comes from the press is its title page. And so I think this is the first thing to consider. Regretfully so, we don't have yet your 1611 KJV Bibles in. If we did, it would make matters this morning better and run more smoothly, because you could see these woodcuts that I'm going to be trying to describe for you. But they'll probably come in tomorrow or the next day, a day or two too late. But then you can go over your notes, and if you can't see this real well from up here or understand what I'm describing, it's very fascinating. The imagery and the symbolism was employed by the Antwerp artist Cornelius Boll in providing these woodcuts, setting the scene for the opening of the Bible and then for the opening of the New Testament. So, title page, there's actually two of them. There's one for the entire Bible, and there's one that starts the New Testament. There's not one that starts the Old. There's one for the entire Bible, and then there's one for the New Testament. And so I certainly couldn't draw this, because it takes an exquisite artist to be able to do this with all of the interlocking symbols and diagrams and designs on here. But I will try to describe what you find on this page. Whenever you get your own Bible, you can look over it and see how it corresponds. Because if you just try to look at it yourself, some of the things you're going to be able to pick out. You'll find it very amusing to look at it, so I would recommend that you do. And if you want to see mine afterwards this morning, of course, you're welcome to. Let's start with the New Testament rather than the one that begins the whole Bible. That one, the one that begins the whole Bible, will take us back into the question of the AV, its origin or identification. Okay, you've got, you're just not going to be able to see it because it's not in color, it's all black and white, but I can kind of hold this as I diagram more or less for you. Let's give ourselves this whole page, and you'll be able to see it as I say on your own. You've got this center section that basically contains the writing. And then you've got like 12 little circles. Supposed to be 12 there. 12 circles down the left side and down the right side of the page. Now going down the left side, running down the left border, are the pictures of the 12 tribes of Israel in the order of birth, which you will find in Genesis 29:32 through Genesis 30:24. Genesis 29:32 through Genesis 30:24. And then, of course, we've got to get Benjamin, who was born so much later than the rest of the brothers, and that would be chapter 35 and verse 18. They are represented by a different symbolic emblem, probably under the influence of Numbers 2, if you'll take time to look at that chapter later. Various symbolic emblems on a shield which is placed in front of a tent. So you'll not be able to see it here, but in each circle you've got like a little tent that may look something like this. And then you've got a shield in front of it. And then you've got some little emblem on it, such as, a serpent, a jackal, a book, a sword, different things like that. Probably, as I say, under the influence of Numbers 2, where they're getting marching orders there, and each tribe was to be responsible under its own banner, and they were to have banners that could be held up. They could be seen for a large distance around it that would rally together the particular people of that tribe. So it's my guess that it's under the influence of Numbers 2. All right, so you got, in other words, the 12 tribes of Israel. Then what would you guess would be down the right border? The 12 apostles. The 12 apostles, in what appears to me to be in the order of Luke 6:14-16. You've got different lists of the apostles, and the lists give a different order. They all start with Simon Peter, and they all end with Judas Iscariot, but in between those two you have a different order. Luke 6:14-16. It appears to me that they are in that order, with the exception that Judas Iscariot is not included. He's dropped off. And Matthias, not Paul, but Matthias is added in his place. So you start up here with Peter, Andrew, James, John, Philip, Bartholomew, right on down through to Matthias, who's number 12 down here in the far extreme bottom right-hand corner. Now at the very top of all of this, which is this little white mark right here, you've got the name of God in Hebrew, Yahweh, the Old Testament name of God in Hebrew. And then, well, you've got a circle with a lamb in it right here. And you've got the sun over here. And the moon over here. And you've got 11 stars. That's probably due to the symbolism of one of the dreams that Joseph had in the book of Genesis, chapter 37, where he saw the sun, the moon, the 11 stars bound down to him, of course representing his mother, his father, and his 11 brethren. So all types of imagery and symbolism are used. Then under that, you've got the figure of a man here, the man here, man here, the man here. Now, who are those four men? The gospel writers. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And alongside each of the four men, you have creatures posed by them under the influence of Revelation 4:7. So that you've got, let's see, Matthew, and you'll see this down through church history and diagrams of the apostles. Matthew's represented by a man. There's a little winged boy right here beside him. Mark represented by a lion, which is crouched behind his shoulder. Luke represented by an ox, which is under his feet. And then John represented by an eagle, which is right there on his shoulder. And then you have the writing, the New Testament of our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ, newly translated out of the original Greek with the former translations diligently compared and revised by His Majesty's special commandment. Now, the one thing that I did mention in the picture, and probably the most conspicuous thing, after you've got all of your writing, it comes down to about here, so down at the very bottom of this white section, you have an altar, and you've got, well, how can I draw it? You have a lamb laying upside down on an altar with a spear piercing his belly, which of course is their symbol of the atonement here. There's the lamb laying upside down on the altar as a sacrificial victim, and its stomach is being pierced with a spear or with a sword. So much for that. Let's go over to the woodcut, the diagram that begins the whole Bible. And this will take us back into our question of the AV, Authorized Version. And this diagram is, well, it's got similarities certainly with the other one, but it's quite a bit different at the same time. I'll try to show it to you again. Of course, you've got your middle section for writing. You have a man over here. I mean, he takes up this much of the picture. And you've got another one over here. This man has this in his hand. Moses with the 10 Commandments, and then he's got a staff in his hand. 10 Commandments here, and he has a staff over there. The other man, of course, he's got a long flowing beard. Doesn't have any horns, thankfully. That's the work of Michelangelo. Over here, you've got a man with a turban wrapped around his head, long beard, long flowing robes. And he's got a little square thing attached right to his chest here, little rows of things. Aaron, the high priest, with his breastplate on. You again have the 4 men, Matthew with their Revelation 4 symbol signs, Matthew, Mark, Luke, the ox is beside him, Luke and John. You again have the Hebrew name of God at the very top. You again have the sun and the moon, 11 stars. You've got a dove right under the Hebrew name of God. Right under that, you have a man carrying a cross, holding it in his arms, and then beside him, a man holding a chalice in his hand. Again, probably signs, symbols of the death of Christ, the cup of the communion and the cross of Christ. And you've got other figures standing around. And then underneath this, you have a picture, and you've got your little lamb with a sword pierced through his neck. And then probably the strangest thing that we have here, we don't have the upside down lamb on the altar again. But the strangest thing we have is down here at the very bottom where you have a pelican voling herself. Now, do you know what that means when a pelican is voling herself? Well, you've got the pelican, it's a big bird, you know what a pelican is, and this is a big mother bird here, and all the little birds right here. And what a pelican will do is the mother, and I think it even has it in the picture, she bends her neck over and pricks her own breast, tears skin away from her own breast, pulls the feathers away and yanks skin away so that she'll bleed, so that her young ones will have something to eat and something to drink that day. It's called a pelican voling herself. Well, that's just a fantastic thought, an image to use that for Christ, that he wounded himself so that his little ones, his offspring, his children could eat and drink his blood and live and survive from him. It's a beautiful thought. That, to me, is probably the prettiest thing in all of the pictures that you'll find in the KJV, is a pelican voling herself. Now, you'll also find, you may want to turn to your KJV title page, and we'll compare this one more time, because we're going to add a couple of things right here. The Holy Bible, containing the Old Testament and the New, newly translated out of the original tongues with the former translations diligently compared and revised by His Majesty's special command. That maybe comes down to, let's say, here. And then you've got one line that's so important that's going to be placed about here that you don't have in yours, but that you'll have in your original, that reads, appointed to be read in churches. Appointed to be read in churches. That you see you don't have. You've got authorized King James Version, something like that. But here in the original 1611, we've got appointed to be read in churches. That would seem to point to the fact that there is some type of legal, formal, that is by decree of the king, a proclamation that sanctions this new work for the English people, appointed to be read in the churches. And then we would say perhaps that then is the origin for knowing this Bible as the AV. It is authorized. If it's appointed, it's authorized. Authorized by whom? By the king. Authorized to be read in the churches. Appointed to be read in the churches. And hence the abbreviation AV for authorized version. But here's an interesting note. We've got several contradictory notes here concerning this business of appointed to be read in the churches. Was, in fact, this Bible ever legally, by a proclamation of the king or by parliament or by convocation or privy council, was this Bible ever really appointed to be read in the churches? Well, we have no record of it. We have no record that the KJV was ever formally authorized either by the king or by parliament or by convocation, the House of Lords, or by privy council. But some people have argued on the opposite side of the issue here. Well, remember, as we discussed several weeks ago, that many of the notes of what originally took place around this time, many of those notes were burned in a great English fire not long after the publication of the KJV. And so we would just say that some, and they were English notes, not ones just having to do with the KJV, but the legal proclamations of the king, of King James the First of England, the Sixth of Scotland, were burned during this time. Accidentally, of course, but in a great fire. And so that would make sense that wherever we've got the register of the formal authorization of this Bible, it simply has been destroyed. And so we have to take at face value what we have here in the KJV. Even though we don't have any documentary evidence to support that, it does say appointed to be read in churches. And so, in fact, it must have been appointed by the king. Well, there's another suggestion, though. Other people make mention of the fact that the printers independently added to copies of the bishop's Bible the following phrase, authorized and appointed to be read in churches. When in fact there was no legal decree, there was nothing by the bishops, there was nothing binding that came from regal authority on the English people. It's simply that the printers, independent of the political authorities and as well as the religious authorities, simply added this to copies of the bishop's Bible for whatever their own personal reason. Authorized and appointed to be read in churches. Well, from what came the KJV? Well, it came from the bishop's Bible. And so perhaps that was just a natural carryover from the bishop's Bible to the KJV, this business of being appointed to be read in churches. It was just naturally carried over, some people argue, into the AV without intending to be formal or without pretending to be from regal authority. Well, the bottom line is no one knows. We do know that's why we refer to it as the AV, because of this one phrase that's found right here on the title page to the whole Bible, appointed to be read in churches. And from that we get authorization, that somehow it was legally authorized. Now this may sound like a technical matter that doesn't need to be discussed, but by pedantics or something, I guess that's true. It doesn't serve us one way or the other. And so the bottom line is to know that we don't know whether or not there was any legal, formal sanction, that was published by declaration that authorized this to be the Bible to actually and literally be read in all of the churches. Of course, we know it not to be a version. Whether it's AV or KJV, both have V's in them. And we've discussed that before. A version is a primary translation made from the original languages without the help of other second language translations. And the title page itself will contradict that in the KJV. It says newly translated out of the original tongues, but with the former translations diligently compared and revised. So if anything, the KJV is not a KJV but a KJT, King James translation. AT, authorized translation, because it's a secondary translation and not a primary one. And to be a version, a translation has to be primary. In addition to the title page, as you will find whenever you peruse your copy, you will find in order the dedicatory epistle, which we have studied in depth. We've already read this whole thing of the setting of the great Occidental star, Queen Elizabeth, and all of that. The epistle of dedication to the king. This is the one who had been enriched with so many singular and extraordinary graces, the one with a thick tongue, remember, that couldn't keep it in his mouth. And we just never were able to discover what those singular, extraordinary graces were. Except that, of course, King James was a man of literature. He was a man of the book. After the epistle dedicatory, you have the preface, the translators to the reader, that you don't have. And this is really sad to see that we don't have this. We would rather swap it, leave out the dedicatory epistle with all of its flowing, flowery language to the king. That was just the common thing to do. Praise him as the greatest man that ever lived. And a lot of it's a lie. And a lot of the people that praised him didn't have those thoughts that they penned in their mind about this man, the king. We'd rather have the translators to the reader, which gives their philosophy of translation. You see it's very tiny print, and it goes for several pages. Several pages. And it's difficult to read, too. All right, then we come to a 12-month religious calendar. This is January. And then February, March, so forth. A 12-month religious calendar that has various feast days and holy days in the church in England, along with morning and evening prayer schedules. For instance, March, this would be the first. A morning reading would be in the book of Deuteronomy. Evening reading would be Deuteronomy 17. You've got readings and you've got prayer schedules that are found there. The next thing you find after a 12-month calendar, after December, is an almanac. It's a whole page of an almanac that goes back to 1603. And of course it's updated as the years go along with further additions of the KJV. And this one actually goes up to 1641. Then after that, you've got more tables and calendars for the reading of Psalms and for certain church lessons. Here are lessons proper for holy days. And they'll have the days, the Feast of St. Andrew, the Feast of St. Stephen, Feast of St. John, Epiphany. I mean, write down your list of a holy day, and you've got certain lessons that would be appropriate for the reading on that day. Then the next thing that you have would be table of contents. The names and order of all the books of the Old and New Testament with the number of their chapters. Here's Old Testament. And here's New Testament. Notice it didn't say anything about the Apocrypha there, and here it is stuck in between Old and New Testament. Again, showing they don't count it as canonical books, as canonical work. And then you start the creation of the world, the first book of Moses. There's your page heading, and as you know from the 1611 KJV, we don't have it anymore. It'll begin with a chapter summary as well. The creation of heaven and earth, of light, firmament, of the earth separated from the waters, and made fruitful, of the sun, moon, and stars, of fish and fowl, of beasts and cattle, of man in the image of God, also the appointment of food. There is their summary of what you'll find here in Genesis chapter 1. Okay, the artist behind all of the work is Cornelius Boel, B-O-E-L, an artist from Antwerp. Cornelius Boel. The printer was Robert Barker, B-A-R-K-E-R. So you don't have this on your title page. Go back to the title page again, looking underneath this line appointed to be read in churches. Then starting here, we have imprinted at London by Robert Barker, printer to the King, Most Excellent Majesty. So we have the name of the printer, Robert Barker. Well, we know something about the Barkers. Queen Elizabeth had given his father, Christopher, a monopoly on printing all religious material in England. And when he died, that is his father Christopher, when he died in 1599, and this was passed on to his son Robert. These were Puritans, by the way, not Anglicans. And the monopoly by the Barker family remained in effect for 100 years in England. They are well-known printers in London, the Barkers. Robert Barker, his father Christopher Barker. We're getting down to the actual printing of the Bible. We've gone through all that leads up to this. We're down to the printing. We know who the printer is. He actually had to put out his own money to the tune of 3,500 pounds, which was a huge sum of money. But he had to put out 3,500 pounds for the new Bible, even though he was the king's printer. A new type was obtained. Boldface was used for the text, and lighter Roman letters for supplied words, which of course, how do we have supplied words today? Italics. Those are words supplied to make up the sense that's deficient in the literal Hebrew or Greek, when perhaps a verb is left out. Lighter Roman letters used for supplied words. Boldface for the text. We know about all of those matters. To some other interesting questions, we don't have answers. Who were the actual printers? I thought Barker was. Well, Barker's the man who runs everything. Who were the men? John and Bob. Who were the actual men with their own hands who gave us this work? We don't know them. Who read the proofs? We don't know them. How long did the actual printing of the Bible take? We don't know that. What was the initial selling price per copy? We don't know that. But other things we do know. Miles Smith and Thomas Bilson, after all the other men had left, gone back home, back to their churches permanently, back to their earlier work, Miles Smith and Thomas Bilson, the two final editors, stayed with the work all the way through. They stayed right here in the printing shop and watched it all the way through. Perhaps they were the ones who read the proofs. That would be a good guess. Who read the proofs? Probably the two final editors, Smith and Bilson, but we don't know. The work had to be divided between two printing shops. Barker had to borrow the materials and equipment of someone else. The work was divided between two printing shops because the demand for quantity was larger than any one shop of that day in London could produce, and that was 20,000 copies. It was a folio edition. We discussed folios and all of that before. It was a folio edition. 2 columns per page. Most Bibles are like that today. With each page enclosed in rules. You know, you'd have it like this. Measuring 9 inches by 14.5 inches. 9 inches by 14.5 inches. Other early editions, ones that came right after this, had larger margins, and therefore measured 10.5 by 16. But that was not the way it was first done. Its 1,500 pages made it 3 inches thick, excluding the binding. 1,500 pages, 3 inches thick, excluding the binding. And then I'm just going to leave you with one other final thought this morning, and then we'll pick up here next time then. What happened to the original handwritten manuscript that was finally put together by Vilson and Smith, brought to Barker, that Barker was to use for the actual work? Well, Robert Barker kept that for his own treasure. And over the years, it vanished. It would be priceless today. And it's never been seen since the 17th century. Probably it was one of those spoils of war and ended up burned somewhere, or used to wrap groceries in fish down at the market. We know similar things have happened with ancient, priceless manuscripts down through the years of antiquity. But that's what we would like to have. What happened to the handwritten copy that came from Bilson and Smith? Well, Barker kept it for himself as, the spoils of the conquest of having a monopoly in England on religious printing. And we don't know what happened to it after that, but it simply vanished.